The Cold War Part 2. The United Nations and China. Here's an overview. China was a U.S. wartime ally in World War II, but they soon started to fall to communism. Mao Zedong had led the Communist Party in China into a civil war in 1927. The national government and the communists worked together during World War II, but post-war, they started to fight again. Jiang Jieshi, who was the leader of the government forces, misused American aid and failed to improve the conditions of the common people. This led to peasants starting to flock towards Zedong. In 1949, the government forces fled to Taiwan and Zedong took over China. The Soviet Union and the atomic bomb test. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949. Now, the US was not the only nation with atomic capabilities. In 1952, the US announced that they created an even more destructive weapon called the hydrogen bomb. However, a year later, the Soviet Union announced that they also had a hydrogen bomb. Now, the two most powerful nations in the world were starting to have an arms race. So basically, who could build the more destructive weapon? The Korean War. Here's a background. The US and the Soviets drove the Japanese out of Korea and divided the Korean occupation at the 38th parallel. This line started to become more of a divider between the communist North Korea and the democratic South Korea. In June of 1950, the North Korean troops went into South Korean territory. Truman called on the UN to protect South Korea, and he also used police action, which is basically an undeclared war in Korea. MacArthur, who was the leader of the UN forces, drove North Korean troops back towards the Chinese border. However, China surprised everybody and came to the aid of the North Koreans. They forced MacArthur and his forces to retreat. MacArthur kept on insisting that the US should bomb China, but however, Truman wanted a limited war. MacArthur campaigned for his idea way too hard, so Truman had to remove him as the leader of the UN forces. MacArthur received a hero's welcome, but the public actually supported Truman's decision as they also wanted a limited war. Point 4 aid. Truman was the first president to use economic aid to fight the Cold War. Truman's inaugural address had a famous fourth point. The fourth point was about how half of the world lived in poverty and the U.S. should try and help them out. Congressional economic aid for developing countries was known as the Point 4 program. The Cold War at home. Here's an overview. Americans started to fear communist expansion in the U.S. There was lots of tension over national security, and many feared that communist spies and sympathizers were hidden in plain sight. So, Truman began loyalty checks on federal employees after information about the atomic bomb got leaked. Loyalty checks consisted of a deep background check to see if the person had any history with communist groups or like groups trying to overthrow the government. And in this period, over 3 million government workers were investigated. The Cold War at home. Anti-communist laws and investigations. The Smith Act, which was in 1940, which is also pre-U.S. entry into World War II, prohibited any group from advocating or teaching about a violent overthrow of the government. It basically outlawed anybody from joining the government. The Supreme Court decided that the Smith Act did not violate the First Amendment in Dennis versus the United States in 1951. They stated that there was a clear and present danger. However, in Yates versus the United States in 1957, the Supreme Court shifted their position a little bit and said that only speech that encouraged people to take action could be prohibited. The McCarran Act of 1950 cracked down on groups accused of complicity with communism. In the 40s, a special committee of the House of Representatives called the House Un-American Activities Committee had hearings on disloyalty. In Watkins versus the United States in 1957, the Supreme Court ruled that witnesses at a congressional hearing can refuse to answer questions that don't relate to the committee's task. Alger Hiss, a former member of the U.S. State Department, got sentenced 5 years in jail after being snitched on by a former communist. The Rosenberg case in 1950. In this case, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg got convicted of passing secrets to aid atomic development in the Soviet Union. Although many spoke against their charges, such as Albert Einstein, they still got executed. Even people who spoke out against the government got labeled as communists. Robert Oppenheimer, who helped build the first atomic bomb, spoke out against building a hydrogen bomb. He was labeled as a security threat and got his security clearance taken away. Cold War at home. McCarthyism. Here's an overview. The fear of communism in the US was especially high during the Korean War. The person most responsible for the public fear was Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy used the public's fear of communism to gain political power. He said that he had a list of communists in the State Department. That was a lie. He also randomly accused a bunch of people of being a communist and got them blacklisted from their industries. And he made himself out to be a quote-unquote patriot. In 1954, McCarthy got cocky and said that the army should be investigated for any hint of communism. The hearings were televised so the whole nation could see the tactics that McCarthy used against the army. McCarthy was a bully in the court, and now the whole nation could see that he was not a patriot after all. McCarthy lost his power and his supporters after this incident. McCarthyism refers to the use of reckless and unfair accusations in the name of suppressing political disloyalty. Politics of the Cold War. China was split into two between the communist government on the mainland and the nationalist government in Taiwan. The U.S. only recognized Jiang's government, so Mao and the communists were shut out of the UN. The Korean War became a stalemate and Truman was blamed. He was also criticized for the inflationary cycle of the economy, the communist victory in China, and his friends being corrupt. These factors, plus McCarthy saying that communism had spread to the government, led to the public wanting a new president. So Eisenhower got elected in 1952. Eisenhower signed an armistice in 1953, which ended the Korean War. And the 38th parallel became the divider between North and South Korea.